Welcome to ASEAN People Speak Season 5. I'm Regine Jessica Abuel, your host for this podcast. For our fifth episode, we will explore ASEAN's capacity to respond to major disasters in the wake of the several earthquakes and climate disasters in the region. Joining us today is the Climate and Mobility Program Manager at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, or RWI. She leads regional work on rights-based climate governance and climate-induced mobility under the SIDA-funded Asia-Pacific Program, working closely with national human rights institutions, universities, and civil society across South and Southeast Asia. Based in Thailand, she has 5 years of experience working on climate and inclusion across the Southeast Asian region. Everyone, let us welcome our fifth guest in this season, Thunpicha Greigarn. Hi, Thun. How are you?
Hi, Regine. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good too. We're so excited to have you with us for the fifth episode for ASEAN People Speak this fifth season. And let's get into the topic for today. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, especially with the dawn of climate change and developing countries specifically experiencing a lot of the effects of climate change. So can you give us a little bit of background or some view on how climate change has affected the ASEAN region in particular? And maybe if you could also share with us the particular earthquakes or natural disasters that have affected the region, particularly the 2025 Myanmar and Thailand earthquakes and its far-reaching humanitarian and socio-economic impacts across ASEAN.
Yes, maybe I'll just start a little bit of context for ASEAN and climate change, but just briefly. Actually, now is the, I think, last day of COP30 negotiations.
Yes,
and I
actually.
I believe about last week or even until today, the Philippines just experienced a huge floods. We also had a flood incident also in Thailand. So it speaks a lot for the ASEAN regions in terms of how vulnerable we are for the changing climate impacts and how it will be getting worse in the upcoming decades if nothing is changed the trajectory to meet the Paris Agreement. And as we know, ASEAN is very, very vulnerable compared to other regions in the world in terms of climate change, even though we're not the huge emission countries, especially for the Philippines and Thailand, definitely not as a big emitting countries in ASEAN. So the fact that we are bearing the burden of the climate impacts is very unfortunate. And that's also one of the, I think, results that we've heard from COP30 in terms of loss and damage. So in terms of earthquake and rights, even though it's a very interesting topic and there's an interesting link to climate impact, because even though earthquake is not directly an effect of climate change, let's say, but in Myanmar and even in Bangkok, Thailand, when the earthquake happened, we see dimensions of climate impacts because when the earthquake hit, and I was also one of the person who experienced it firsthand here in Bangkok.
Oh, okay.
It was during, I believe, around noon or 1 p.m. So it was midday. It was about 35 degrees Celsius in Bangkok. And it was about 4 degrees in Mandalay and the regions that was impacted by the earthquake in Myanmar. So when people need to evacuate it outside, and that's usually the instinct of populations who have not been trained or experienced by the earthquake, was to get out of the building because they didn't know that it was an earthquake even. They were faced with this extreme heat. And they didn't feel safe to go into the buildings. They didn't even feel safe to go anywhere that, have an existing infrastructure. So a lot of them experiencing impact from heat. I think there were an incident of people experiencing heat strokes. There were issues with trying to find shades in the area. There were a lot of people, at least from Bangkok, that they tried to escape to the parks area to find a little bit of shades. But that was one of the climate links to earthquake, because when we weren't prepared or trained in terms of how to, manage the populations during earthquake, people were in a way freaking out, and they didn't know what is the right thing to do. And when they experienced heat in the cities that were like 35 degrees Celsius or 45 degrees Celsius, that could have a huge impact for those who are already vulnerable to heat.
Yeah, and I see that you've mentioned certain effects of climate change, and well, earthquake is not really a direct result of climate change, but you could see that because of that natural disaster, there is certain things that happen, and it had like consequences when it comes to the safety, the lives, and even like just even the temperature affecting people's lives. And we have talked about how it has affected there in Thailand. And maybe you could also just, as we see this as a very big problem, and this has to be addressed. In terms of humanitarian response and coordination, can you tell us your assessment or what you think about ASEAN's disaster risk management mechanisms? I mean, we've identified certain problems, but can you also share with us maybe some key lessons as well, or coordination gaps? And later on, like if there are best practices in the regional or local in the regional or local level.
Yes. So before I mention the ASEAN mechanism, maybe I'll just briefly explain in terms of how each country, Thailand and Myanmar, responds to the earthquake, because it was quite very different, and it's reflecting how ASEAN's mechanism evolved later once the earthquake hit. So for Thailand, the provinces that have been impacted by the earthquake were about 100 and 300 kilometers away from where the earthquake actually happened in Mandalay in Myanmar. But because of the soft soil for the cities, we feel the impact heavily, including in Bangkok. And this is quite rare for Bangkok. So when the earthquake happens, there were about 3 key issues that we're facing, and there were some responses as well. So the first issues was that people didn't know there was earthquake.
Okay.
And there was a dimension of rights to information, because I think it was about 5 hours after the earthquake happened that we finally received an official text or messages from the government that this is an earthquake, and a little bit of protocols of what to do. But clearly 5 hours is way too slow.
Yes.
People already, moved to the certain areas. They've already evacuated. They've already responded on their own. And there were a lot of misinformations, whether you can go into the buildings, whether you need to even leave the town. A lot of people that I know immediately drive out of the city because they didn't feel safe. So that rights to information becomes a key issue for Thailand. And the next rights that we see that are being at risk were the rights to being rescued. We have elderly populations and people with disabilities who were left behind during the earthquake situation, mainly because it wasn't quite accessible for them to escape in the same way for the non-vulnerable population. The regular people were already freaking out and they just run. We weren't trained to, how to help those in need or even to protect ourselves. So the first instinct was to run and get out of the building. So a lot of elderly people and people with disabilities were just left there. And there were no protocols in terms of what to do. Even the hospitals also have to improvise. But fortunately, they do have some trainings during COVID era where they were able to move the patients outside of the buildings into certain area, and they were more used to at least the situation that were normal. And lastly, it was obviously the right to life. We have one incident of the building completely collapse. It was a building under construction, and I think about 19 people passed away because of the collapse. They were all construction workers, and this exposed how the buildings might be corrupted. It's still under investigation because it was only that building that was completely collapsed. And some of the workers were migrant workers. And so there's a lot of discussion and debates in terms of justice for these workers.
Yes.
And how the system would be able to compensate the family even fairly, and layers of dimensions of rights that they were being violated. And that's something that we'll still need to follow. And there were already some response mechanism by the city of Bangkok and the national government. For example, the city of Bangkok act really quickly before the national government acts. They try to communicate with the people through their social media platform. In terms of the aftershocks, they quickly opened the public places, such as the parks, in order to make sure that at least people have somewhere to go if they don't feel safe to go into the buildings. However, that's still not quite enough in terms of how quick the national government acts, and mainly also because the delay for communications. This is one thing that we'll discuss later as well from ASEAN mechanism. And for Myanmar, the situation is very different because they felt the impact right there and then, where the epicenter is. And I think there were 1,600 deaths. Many were injured. One of the towers was like 70% impacted. Like we see clear infrastructure were collapsed. A hospital was shut down. Even the internet were not working. So it was very different situation impacts. And because of the political situation already in Myanmar, it was much harder for humanitarian response to get in to the country. Yes, and this is, I think, at least for Myanmar, ASEAN can potentially have a huge role, but there were also some gaps that I hope that ASEAN would take and learn and improve in the future. For example, one of the mechanism for ASEAN was the AHR, the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management. And its roles is to deploy emergency response and assessment tests within the first 24 to 48 hours. However,
was it effective? Yes, was that effective?
So yeah, the gap was that it needs to receive a consent from the country in order to enter, and obviously it was delayed. And
so that's a barrier. I mean,
yes,
that's
that
like
was one
something.
of the barrier.
It was the mechanism was in place, but then since there needs to be an enactment or an like an additional action coming from the state government, it posed as a delay or a problem instead of an immediate response.
Yes, and there were currently no standing search and rescue team, which
Oh.
obviously something that needs resource and potentially could be, proposed in the future.
Mhm.
So Myanmar have to rely heavily on the national contributions, and they do not have heavy machines, for example, to help pull pieces of the buildings to help people who were stuck under the building that were collapsed. And there were currently still no civil military coordination mandates,
Mhm.
which can be critical during complex emergencies, because for Thailand, for example, the military also helped step in using some of their equipment to help with clearing the buildings that were collapsed on the street as well. So that was one of the gaps for ASEAN, mainly in terms of receiving the consent from the country, and that was quite delay. Another mechanism that we have is the AADMER, or the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response.
Mhm.
This one was established in 2009, and it appoints the national focal points for each country, and it set the baseline for cooperation among the ASEAN member states. We
Mm.
do some joint exercise on early warnings and
Mhm.
technical, cooperations. However, during the earthquake
Actual,
situation,
yes, the actual
yes,
situation. How was it?
yes,
I mean, was it being implemented properly, or how did it go then?
yes. So they tried their best, but there's still some gaps, and I think they will take that, and they actually just issue a new work program in October, in which I'll probably might briefly mention later. But earlier, when the earthquake happened in March, they were having an issue with humanitarian access because of how Myanmar was a conflict zone and it was politically constrained. So it was difficult for the team to get a clearance to get into the country, for example, even though I think about 24 hours after the earthquake, like Myanmar
Oh,
finally declared that to the ASEAN that they
they
requested
are in it.
humanitarian, yeah, support. But it was quite already
Mm.
delayed, and
Mhm.
to clear the borders, it was difficult because of the existing political turmoil that they have.
Yes.
And that one was one of the gaps, because there's no enforcement mechanism. It all depends on the state will. And when a country like Myanmar, who already lack in terms of resource, um, they were obviously delayed to do the official
Response.
ASEAN
Yes.
process. Yes.
Mhm. And you've actually identified very concrete examples of these coordination gaps. Now, maybe we can also now talk about how ASEAN should strengthen its disaster response frameworks. We've talked about the problems encountered, especially when it comes to actual situations where certain mechanisms are supposed to be in place, but because of like state action or certain things that have to be in place, like protocols for humanitarian aid to be given, what are the things then that ASEAN could do to enhance cross-border cooperation and later on ensure that recovery and rebuilding efforts are guided by human rights and resilience principles?
So actually, as briefly mentioned, that there is a new work plan for the AADMER for 2026 to 2030, in which they already address some of the gaps, including there's a new search coordination platform, uh, in hoping that it would increase the speed for multi-country deployment, in which I think we'll see in details in the new program. There were also an integration protection of gender and inclusion in all the responses. So now there's a mandates and guidelines for gender and social inclusion, which didn't exist before. And they're trying to push for multi-hazard risk modeling, in which this one will start blending in more data from the climate, seismic, and socioeconomic data to understand better for the hazard risk modeling. Maybe this is less applicable for earthquake, but it would help a lot for floods or heavy storms events. And lastly, they're trying to improve the digital early warning system so that this would help a lot in terms of relaying the information in the fastest way possible to everyone. However, there's still some improvements, especially from the rights-based approach and human rights angles, especially in terms of codifying the word rights in terms of accessibility and inclusion and health. That is not non-negotiable, and it should also be in all responses. There should also be, some joint exercise that includes the situation during heat events, like the high heat events, but in particular, as well as for how to help evacuate the disabilities groups as well as elderly. They could emphasize that angle as well. Another angle from rights perspective is when they're doing the cell broadcast of the early warning system, they need to consider everyone because now there's a huge gaps in terms of the language. There were also, people who aren't the SIM countries holder, like a lot of migrant workers who do not have Thai SIMs or do not read Thais, or even foreigners or tourists who, could not access the information. So from that access to information angle, that should, that could improve. And maybe lastly, just in terms of public accountability, while this is a lot of national matters, but maybe some mechanism that require the government to push for or publish after action reviews and not just internal assessments. Even, the buildings that were completely collapsed in Bangkok, there should be some public accountability and maybe after action reviews that could also goes into post recovery phase of disaster management.
Yeah, actually, and thank you so much for mentioning that. And I would like to pick that last thing that you said, the public accountability, that after the disaster happens, it's not just about like humanitarian. Of course, it's important to have humanitarian aid and getting systems better and in place, but also actually acknowledging like how do you pick the pieces up? How do you try to avoid certain situations, especially when like buildings collapse, people are displaced, or there are like more negative effects when it's like especially when the heat increases? And how would you address that in terms of like addressing these basic human rights that are greatly affected because of this natural disasters? Well, thank you so much, Thun, for your insights and all the things that you have shared with us for this episode. I'm sure our listeners were able to get a lot from what you have mentioned, especially with regard to earthquakes, aid, and how the ASEAN could devise or better create frameworks or disaster risk mechanisms when it comes to these situations. Thank you so much also for sharing your experiences. Before we end, would you like our listeners to know any about your social media account, your website or organization, publications, or any upcoming projects that you would like to plug in?
Yes, just maybe a little bit about RWY. We are human rights, humanitarian academic institutions. So we publish quite numbers of reports from the right-based angles and the human rights-based approach on many thematic areas, and one of them is including environment and climate. So if you are interested to understand more in terms of human rights angles to disaster management and even environmental issues, we do have a lot of publication on those, as well as some of the reports for Asia and Pacific region as well.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Thun, for enlightening us, our listeners, with regard to those information. Thank you for today and join us again next week, guys. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on Spotify to stay updated and never miss an episode. You can also stay connected with us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by following at WGSCNHRMEC. For more in depth information, you can visit our website at ASEANHRMEC.org. Thank you so much, guys, for listening today. We hope you were able to get a lot from our conversation with Thun. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. Bye.